Hi folks, I wanted to record a second screencast this week about fair use, complementing the one that I've already shared about our work so far in the class and the ethics readings. Fair use is something I talk about in almost every class because it's very complicated. It has to do with copyright, it has to do with some fairly arcane laws. Fair use doesn't get taught a lot because it's not necessarily professional writing proper, and a lot of other areas of the social sciences don't really have time to fit it in. And fair use is absolutely essential for enabling criticism, public engagement, and for the most important work we're doing this semester, design. Please share the questions that you have about fair use and copyright in the Blackboard activity space for this week. Reviewing your responses, some of you have quite a bit of questions about how you can think through fair use in your projects. I hope you'll share these questions and I'll do my best to answer them. One of the things I'll miss this semester is having a chance to spend time on this in class when we can have a really good discussion. Now, there are three types of intellectual property that we can be concerned about in a design context. The first is copyright, and that covers expressions of ideas. So it's things like music and writing. If you're talking about an idea or a method, that's not covered by copyright. That's covered by patents. And patents have a shorter time that they can be protected and are less flexible about what fits into their definition. And finally, brands and identities are protected by trademarks. Those don't have expiration dates built in. They work as long as people use them. Now, fair use only applies to copyright. So we're going to talk about copyright here, and these other types of intellectual property we're not going to worry about. So what can be copyrighted? The law says original works of authorship that are fixed in a tangible medium or tangible form of expression. And this is basically anything that you can write or record or uh, express in some way. So here's a list: literature, music, both compositions and recording, movies, both traditional moving pictures and animations, drawings, three-dimensional art, including architecture. All these things can be copyrighted. Copyright is part of the Constitution. Here's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8. I won't read the whole thing to you here, but look at the purpose here: to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. So copyright is connected to the public good. It's about the progress of culture, about making things that everybody can have access to in the long term. That's what the limited times are about. So I want you to imagine, when you think about copyright, a sort of triangle trade between the people who create things, government, and the public. So if you create something, you submit a copy to the Library of Congress if you choose to register your copyright. What do you get in return? Government protection. You get a time period where you have a limited monopoly on what you've produced. When that limited is time up, the copy that you submitted to the Library of Congress through registration is ready for the public to use. But the key question here is, what does limited mean? That's the part of the definition that has changed quite a bit over time. Securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right. Copyright terms have gotten much longer. The original copyright in 1790 was 14 years plus 14 extended. Look at the progression on the slide here: 1831, 1909, and then 1976. Copyright extends to the life of the author plus 50 years. This is a very, very long period of time. And in fact, there was a court case in 2003 which asked if the copyright extension of life plus 70 in the 1998 copyright law was in fact constitutional, because that was effectively an unlimited term. What does this limited term look like? If you were a corporation and you copyrighted something today, and people are doing it all the time, that work of art or design or music or television show or football broadcast is copyrighted until 2115. That doesn't even sound like a year. If you copyright something and live to be 80 years old, that work of art or music or a story doesn't come out of copyright until 2140. And on the one hand, that may sound great. Hey, it's my stuff. I should be allowed to lock it up. On the other hand, if the point here is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts, is it a good idea for things to be locked down in a monopoly for 100 or even 120 years? This is when fair use comes in. Fair use is an exception, an exemption to the copyright law that was included in 1976 when the copyright extension went into effect to make it life plus 50 years. So let's modify that trade earlier and add a key line here, the third one. Exceptions become available through fair use, both for the public good and to secure individual rights that might otherwise be pushed aside by very exclusive copyright. So let's talk about what fair use is. Unfortunately, the implementation of fair use is complicated. Here's a quote from one of our readings, the University of Minnesota Fair Use site, which has lots of other pages that I hope you'll work through if you have time and if you're interested in this subject. No one factor is decisive. You always have to consider all of them and some additional questions. There are rarely definitive answers outside of courts. This is the big problem with fair use, is to figure out if a use is fair, often you have to go to court. But you can do some work beforehand to make sure or to reduce the risk of being accused of an unfair use. Now, the most important thing to remember about copyright and fair use, and even some things like intellectual property, trademarks, and patents, you've probably heard some absolutes about how this stuff works. Those absolutes are almost always incorrect. Here's a list of 6 that you may have heard. Oh, just change some of the wording and you'll be okay. Well, I'm not making a profit, so this will be fine. I wrote this thing, so I get to do whatever I want with it and I control it. No, these absolutes are wrong, and they have to be wrong for specific reasons. Think about writing a movie review. Let's say you wanted to write a review of a movie for a magazine, and it wasn't a very kind review. You thought the movie wasn't very good. If there was no such thing as fair use, the people who produced the movie could sue you for a copyright violation and prevent you from publishing your critical movie review. So there are very, very key reasons why copyright cannot be absolute. There have to be exemptions to copyright. So here's how fair use makes those exemptions. This is the 4-part test that's in the University of Minnesota readings. I won't read this, but please note that the first word gives you the shorthand: purpose, nature, amount, and effect. Those 4 things are considered, and we try to figure out if a use is fair by balancing the way that those are being used for a particular thing. Now let's work through an example that might be common for us in our class, because in my mind it's easier to understand these things with good examples. So imagine using a photo as part of your redesign flyer. Here are the 4 different areas, and I've put for each one, following the University of Minnesota readings, whether the use favors or is against fair use. And again, I won't read all this to you, but I've highlighted in gray the things here that are the most important. Because we're in an educational context, that favors fair use. Because the work is creative, that goes against fair use. Because we're using the entire work, that goes against fair use. But because the work is being used one time and it's not publicly distributed, that favors fair use. Now, 9 times out of 10, in an educational context, the first and the 4th items here, the purpose and the effect, will combine to outweigh the others the nature of the creative work, regardless of what that is, even if it's something different beside a photo, and the amount. And the reason for that is probably obvious. In an educational context, especially a non-commercial one, we should be a little bit more tolerant of fair use because the fair use of you using the photo enables you to learn how to design. This is going in your Google Drive, so it's not being published. So your using the photo doesn't impact the person who created it. Now, because fair use is complicated, because lawyers are often involved, what can we do to make sure that it doesn't become a problem for us? What can we do to balance seeking permission for things or not using copyrighted things with fair use? So 5 things here for you. First, use the University of Minnesota Thinking for Fair Use tool that I linked up in the readings this week. This tool can help you document your fair use rationale in detail and help you make an educated decision about whether or not your use is fair. And in the event that someone says to you, hey, this is a copyright violation, this isn't a fair use, you can show them that you worked in good faith here and point out that this use should be considered fair. Third, you can always seek permission from the copyright holder to use a work. Sometimes they'll give it to you for a small fee. Sometimes they'll give it to you without a fee at all if you credit them. Copyright holders can have a lot of latitude in this area, and it never hurts to ask. Fourth, you can find alternatives to the copyrighted work. Maybe there's a photo that gets the job done, which is licensed with Creative Commons or is in the public domain. One example of that is things that are created by government employees. By law, anything created by someone from the United States government is in the public domain. So, for example, the White House photographer who's taking pictures every day of the work of our government, everything that they're taking pictures of, you can use without asking for permission and without paying a royalty. And finally, turn to Austin Kleon here. Make something that you can use yourself based on the original work, but transform it to really highlight the things about it that are interesting to you and make sense for your work. So I'll remind you, please share the fair use and copyright questions that you have after thinking about your projects, reading the readings, and thinking about any other contexts of copyright and fair use that you might have. For example, maybe you're in a student organization that wants to use some images in their work. Let's talk about that. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. One of the things I miss the most about quarantine is not seeing you folks. So thanks for watching and listening. Please get in touch with me if you have any questions about this or any other part of your work for English 309.